Hello everyone, Bevins here or Brandon here from CEDH Budget Brews, and today we're going to talk about interaction that's free to cast but under $5. We're going to start with blue. Daze is great because instead of paying mana to counter a spell, you can return an island to your hand. Typically your opponent is going to be tapping out to cast what they're doing, or they need a certain amount of mana in order to be able to cast what they want to in sequence. So even if they do pay the one extra, that could potentially set them back an entire turn. Of course, the downsides to Daze being that you have to bounce an island that you already control to your hand in order to cast it, which means you lose tempo, and you really want to be in a heavy blue deck in order to utilize it properly. You mainly want to be in 2 or 1 color decks in order to run this card and be able to consistently get it to cast for free. Moving on to Disrupting Shoal, which is great for decks that have a lot of similar mana costs. Typically, you see these run in decks that are control heavy or they have a really low average mana cost. So a lot of the cards that they have are 1 or 2 drops. So whenever an opponent does cast a 1 or 2 drop, you get to counter it if it's scary, such as Soul Rings, Dockside Extortionist, things like that. Potential downsides of Disrupting Shoal is that you want a lot of blue cards and you want them to be of similar mana value due to its restriction. It could feel a little awkward playing it at first, but once you get used to it and you know what your opponents are also playing, you can kind of brace for impact and what to counter and what not to. Moving on to Misdirection. This card is bonkers. It's one of my favorites on this list, and I highly recommend picking one up if you have the extra moolah for it. It's 3 and a blue, except you can pitch any blue card rather than paying its mana cost, and it says change target spell with a single target, which is really, really good if your opponents run a lot of single target removal, or if they run a lot of counter spells. You get to use this in response to protect your stuff. If it's removal, such as Abrupt Decay, they pay the 2 mana for you to destroy it. It's really, really good when it's used properly. It takes a little bit of getting used to. This is also the least restrictive of the last two because you pitch any blue card. You don't really lose tempo for it, but you do lose cards in hand. Probably the most useful because it doesn't rely as heavily on your opponents. You can use it on pretty much any spell that they cast. Moving on. Now let's talk about Mental Misstep. This card is also really good. You pay 2 life or you can play 1 blue. It's a counter target spell with mana cost of 1. That could potentially be really, really good if you're going against people who have a little bit more optimized decks. So they're running things such as, of course, Soul Rings, which is in most decks, or Swords to Plowshares, or Veil of Summer. The list can go on. Although there's this restriction of being only able to counter 1, mana value of 1, it's amazing early game and could potentially protect your pieces. It's also really good against, kind of mid to higher power decks or against mid to higher power decks because people are running a lot of slimmer interaction, which this could potentially, save your board, save a game. I've had it win me games before for just paying that 2 life. It's really, really good. And again, if you have the extra moolah for it, I highly, highly suggest it. Alrighty, now let's talk about black. Massacre. This card is 2 and 2 black. Or if you control a swamp and your opponent controls a plains, you can cast it for free. This is the whole point of this video. And all creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. What makes this really good is that this is a potential board wipe. If you have people who are running a lot of dorks or weenies, mono white weenies, or just a lot of tokens, things like that, goblin players, things like that, you could potentially wipe their board and still be in a pretty good position of your own. On top of that, let's talk about the downsides. This card requires 2 major things. For you to have a swamp and your opponent to have a plains, specifically. So in some metas, this could be a dud, completely useless. Or in pods, your opponents are going to be running any white, and that could potentially set you back. If you do know your pod well enough and you do decide to slot this in, it could potentially be an extreme powerhouse. In most casual metas, this card's pretty good. Slaughter Pact. Definitely one of the upper echelon of free black spells, in my opinion. It's a 0 drop, so you cast it for free no matter what. Destroy target non-black creature at the beginning of your next upkeep. Pay 2 and a black. If you don't, you lose the game. What makes this card good is that you could potentially tap out and do whatever you need to on your turn. Or if you're running, black and blue, you can counter your opponent's other stuff and you tap out. And your opponent casts something really scary. Well, instead of them keeping it, you get to destroy it. And if it's non-black, makes this card bad is, of course, you get to lose the game. So if your opponents have, land removal or anything that could potentially take your mana away from you, you could lose upon casting this, basically. And of course, it targets a non-black creature. So in some metas, a lot of your friends or your opponents are running nothing but black. It really depends on how good this card can be. Typically, it's really good because, you have a lot of people who are running not black. You could just snipe a creature that's scary to you. Also, if you weren't expecting them to cast something scary and they do, well, you have an answer for it. And that's really good. And again, if your opponents are running a lot of black or they're like heavy black, it could make this card pretty useless. For the most part, it's really good. Snuff Out, another kind of hidden gem, which is what this list is mainly comprised of. It's 3 and a black. Instant, if you control a swamp, you may pay 4 life rather than pay this spell's mana cost. Destroy target non-black creature, it can't be regenerated. So it's kind of similar to a mix of Massacre and Slaughter Pact in that you have to control a swamp. You can pay 4 life rather than pay. You have to destroy target non-black creature. Downside being non-black. Upside being you're not going to lose if you cast this. It's a great piece of targeted removal. It's typically free in most black decks. Depending on the meta, it could be a dud if you're running into a lot of black heavy pods. And because you don't instantly lose the game, I think this card should be in more decks. I think Slaughter Pact should also be in more decks, but this is a little bit better because that 4 life isn't really important. Now, let's move on to red, one of my personal favorite colors. Mog Salvage, 2 in a red instant. It's kind of like Massacre in that your opponent has to have an island and you have to have a mountain. Of course, you get to cast them free if those casting requirements are met. Destroy target artifact. What makes this good is that, of course, it's a free spell. Most free spells are good in some way, shape, or form, but you get to destroy a target artifact. So if your opponents are playing something like Mycosynth Lattice or any other scary artifacts like that, you get to snipe it for free if you have a mountain and they have an island. Of course, the downside being the casting requirements. You needing an island is pretty often gonna be met. Your opponents don't run any blue. Again, like the last few cards, it'll be a dud. Now let's talk about Thunderclap. Instant, you may sacrifice a mountain rather than pay the spell's mana cost. Deals 3 damage to target creature. So there's a few things to unpack here. You have to sack a mountain, so you lose tempo. And it deals 3 damage to target creature. So if your opponents have, weird things like hexproof or things like that, you wouldn't really be able to target their creature. Because it's 3 damage to target creature, you keep pretty much snipe most things in, definitely a competitive meta. You get to snipe most things in a more casual meta as well. Most people aren't running things that are more than 3 toughness in their 99. Their commander might be a little bit strong, but it takes care of Najeelas, it takes care of Tymnas, it takes care of Drannith Magistrates. It's all around a really good piece of targeted removal if you have the mountain for it. If you're in something that's a little bit more fragile, that really can't sack the mountain, this card wouldn't be a good fit. But in most red decks, it's definitely a good fit. Especially a mono red deck, yes sir. Moving on to Mind Collapse, which is similar to Thunderclap, although a little bit different. The main difference is being only if it's your turn, you could cast Sack of Mountain, pay its mana cost to cast it for free. And instead of it dealing 3 damage, it does 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker. So it's a little bit more versatile in that it can target a creature or a planeswalker. Of course, it has to be your turn in order for you to sack that mountain. If it's your opponent's turns, you have to pay that 4. Typically, it's still really good because most creatures will die to 5 damage, and most planeswalkers will die to 5 damage. So the fact that it can get rid of creatures or planeswalkers make it good. Of course, you still sack that mountain, which makes you lose tempo. And again, like Thunderclap, if you're in a deck that can't really afford to sack mountains or lands, then it's not as good of a fit. And of course, if your opponents are running things like Indestructible and stuff like that, then it's not that good of a fit either. And Pyrokinesis, another pitch card. You may exile a red card rather than pay the spell's mana cost. Deals 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures. There's a few things to unpack here, right? Instead of you paying the 6, it's an instant. You get to just exile any red card. So it makes it a little bit more versatile because you don't sack mountains and you can pitch any red card. So if you're running heavy red, it's not really much of an issue. Of course, if you're not running heavy red, it could be an issue. And of course, moving on, deals 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures. So it could deal damage to up to 4 creatures or as little as 1. So if it could be a little bit more versatile because you can kind of choose and pick what to do with the damage. So let's say, your opponent has a 2/2 and there are 2 1/1s, you get to snipe all 3 of them and kill them. Or if your opponent just has, a 2/4, you get to point all 4 damage at it if it's scary and kill it, no problem. Of course, there are some secret texts where, so again, it requires heavy red. If you're not in heavy red or if you're in more than 2 colors, it could potentially make this card a little bit harder to cast and maybe not worth it. But overall, this card is really, really good, especially in lower power metas. Continuing with pitch cards, we're going to talk about Cave In. You may exile a red card from your hand, so any red card, no problem. And deals 2 damage to each creature and each player. So it's kind of a mix of Pyrokinesis, Massacre. Except instead of each creature getting -2/-2, it deals 2 damage to each creature and player. Potentially, it could kill your opponents if they're really, really low. It could board wipe if they're running a lot of 2 and under. Instead of you a certain type of land and you needing a certain type of land, you can exile any red card. So again, if you're in heavy red, you're good to cast this normally for free. Whereas if you're in 3 or more colors, it's going to be difficult, just like my Pyrokinesis. And it's a board wipe, so people are being rude boys. You can cast this and ruin their day. So we're only going to be talking about 1 green card today, and that's because most other green cards, like free just cast green cards, really only increase like the creature's power and toughness, or they may give you a little bit of life. And that's not really what we're aiming for here. We're aiming to do metaphorical damage to the opponent instead of physical damage. We want to be able to interact with the board state and kind of leverage ourselves above them to get to a win. And that's why we're talking about Reverent Silence. If you control a forest, you can have each other player gain 6 life. That's potentially, in a pot of 4, each other player is going to be 6, 12, 18. That's 18 life that's being gained total. But if you're in green, you're running big stompy creatures, right? Or at least a way to kill them quickly. So it's not really much of an upside for them because typically if you're in green, you have a way to get it back down. And because it requires you to have a forest, it's much, much easier to cast in multiple colors because typically you're going to need at least that forest in play. And then on top of that, it says destroy all enchant. So if you're in a creature heavy build or even an artifact heavy build, this could potentially be really, really good, especially if your opponents are running a lot of enchantments, a lot of ways to get forward with enchantments. This is a special kind of board wipe that doesn't see a lot of play, but I think it should see more play because it's very unique, and especially in lower power and casual pods, it's extremely powerful. I didn't think it was that strong, and then I played it a couple times, and it almost always got me farther ahead than everyone else at the table. Even if they did gain that 6 life, even the fact that they gained the 6 life didn't matter to me because they lost all of their engine, or they lost what was putting them ahead so fast. And it slowed them down considerably. This card is very, very good. So again, we're going to move on to white. Again, we're only talking about one card in this one. And that's because typically white free to cast spells gain you life, or they do something weird that doesn't really matter all that much and doesn't interact with the board state at all. But we're going to be looking at Abolish, which you may discard a Plains card rather than play the spell's mana cost to destroy target artifact or enchantment. So let's break this down a little bit, right? You can discard a Plains, so it's not any white card. So that's a little bit more restrictive in that you need a Plains, but you're not sacrificing a Plains, so you're not losing tempo. That's really good. And you can destroy target artifact or enchantment, so it's a little bit more leeway, considering that most decks run both, potentially really powerful, and can snipe someone's win, or can snipe someone's value engine to get you ahead of them. Again, because it requires you to discard a land, that could kind of be a feels bad sometimes, but I would much rather discard a land than lose a game. But that's my personal opinion. That's all we've got for today. I hope you all enjoyed. Let me know of any other potentially free to cast spells that you would want us to go over, or what your favorite spells are that are free to cast. We'll be doing a video about 1 mana value cards soon. If you have any suggestions, let us know what you want to see. If you have any suggestions, let us know what you want to see in the comments below. You can hit us up on Discord. If you want to support us, please join our Patreon. You can join us for as little as $1 a month, and that helps keeps the light on for Tim and I. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much. Bye.